So I was there, and they said, hey, you need to meet Farshad. He has a powerful story, too, where he came from and the journey he's been on. And if you guys haven't heard his whole journey, you need to. So I met him, we connected, and then usually the only time we connect is in Orlando, Florida at the John Maxwell training. How ironic. We both live in Southern California. We're so busy that we meet about once or twice a year in Orlando. Go figure, right? But no, seriously, me and Farshad, we connected that day 7 years ago, and it's continued to compound. When John talked about layered learning, I was just thinking about how I've continued to learn from Farshad, very successful entrepreneur. I'm working on getting out of a 9-to-5, and I'm right behind him. We've been working hand in hand on a lot of stuff. So he's always brought me along. On this one, with the prisons, I said, let me bring him along. So it didn't stop there. So we ended up going to do the graduation speech, and while there, a conversation took place that I didn't see coming, and that changed the trajectory of Farshad's life, my life, a group of inmates, and it's in the process of affecting many others. So that was, when we're in the visiting room, these guys, so sometimes people look at inmates as they're in there stuck, they're just going to lift weights and beating up each other. These group of inmates I'm talking about, they're game changers. These guys are clinical counselors. They could get a job running a drug and alcohol home out here. They're getting degrees. They've done a lot of different things. They play interracial sports when that's not acceptable in there. They take, talking about courage, them guys got courage. So from there, Farshad knows enough about them that they're game changers. But he sees something in them that they don't see in themselves. And he says, hey, have you ever thought about touching the lives of people outside of here? And they said, well, we don't have nothing to give. Farshad looked at him for a little while and said, you don't have nothing to give. You guys have gone through some stuff. You guys got stories, and you guys have learned and grown and transformed. I think you got lots to give. So he shared with them and just expressed that, what do you think about gathering some stories? That's like the first seeds. He said, why don't you just try this? Why don't you gather 30 stories and get back to me? So he was just seeing where they were at. He gave them the ball and see if they're going to run with it. 2 years later, they came, they refined 11 stories, and they wrote a book. It's called Men Built for Others. It's an awesome book, and I have the privilege and honor of bringing up my friend Johnny Howe, who's one of the authors. His chapter's in there, and he's going to share a little bit, but let me share a little bit about Johnny. So he grew up in the next city that I did, and I didn't meet him till about, when was it, Johnny? 4 years ago, 3 years ago? So I was pouring into Richard and another one of the authors named Ted, and they brought along Johnny. Johnny came along and attached his, attach his wagon to his horse, or the other way around? So he joined the group. They were working together. And how long you been in, Johnny? He was in 28 years in prison. I think I've seen a couple people here. Jose's one of them, and there was maybe a woman or two that probably he was already in prison before you were born. He's been out now. Tomorrow makes 8 months that he's been out. So let's give a warm welcome to Johnny Howe.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Johnny Howe. So it's interesting how this is about leadership, because it made me think back to how I lived my life as a follower. And something that Deborah said is, talking about attitude. And something that I heard was that an attitude is like windshield wipers. It doesn't stop it from raining, but it gets you to where you need to go. So at the age of 17, I lived as a follower, gang member, criminal, drug addict. And I drove in with some people that I consider friends to do what I thought was going to be a beer run, which is you run in the store, steal some beer, and you come back out. Well, that happened, but something else happened too. I picked up a gun, and I chose to shoot and take another man's life for $27.96 of alcohol. And at that time in my life, I told myself, well, I'm a criminal and a gang member. That's what I do. But as I grew up, I started looking back at my past. And there's some things that I experienced, not to make excuses, but some things that contributed to my thinking. And one of the things was about 8 years old. My mother suffered from alcoholism and depression. And came out in the morning to use the restroom, and she was drinking. And she tells, the reason I had you was to keep your dad around. So as I grew up, I'm like, man, I failed at that. And then at 13, she tells me, I know you're a gang member, and I know you're selling drugs. Just don't get caught. So there's a part of me that was extremely excited. I was like, I get to do whatever I want at 13. But there's a bigger part of me that said that I wasn't worth it, that I wasn't worth the fight. So when I committed this crime, I seen the look at my mother's face, and I devastated her. I shamed her. And there's even people who told her, well, at least my son's not a murderer. And I was like, I'm going to do whatever I can to try to help her lift her head up a little bit. So I ended up going to school. I got my GED, my high school diploma, my AA degree, my BS degree. And I was making choices to make her happy, to live for her. And she died a few years later. And after that, I gave up. I went back to the lifestyle that I lived. So for the next 15 years, what I did was live like a criminal while I was in prison, involved in riots and drug trafficking, and came to a point in 2010 where I had an opportunity to go home. As a lifer, you have to appear in front of the board, and they'll tell you, you know what, you're suitable for parole, you're not suitable. So I went that day, and I went to hopefully be found suitable, and I received a 15-year denial. They told me I have to do at least 15 more years. And there's a guy that I was with. He invited me into a group, and one of the projects in the group was a 3-day seminar. And they said, we want you to write out a 10-year vision. And I said, I'm going to be in prison. They just gave me 15 years. And what happened was they said, forget that, dream a little bit. And they talk about dreaming earlier today. So I said, you know what, I want to be an alcohol and drug counselor. I want to get married, and I want to get out of prison. So I go back the next day and share that with them and tell them, hey, look, I did your homework assignment, but I'm going to be in prison. So they said, well, the invitation is to start living from your future, to start making decisions as if you're an alcohol and drug counselor. So that's what I began to do. I went back to school. I got certified as an alcohol and drug counselor. My high school sweetheart came back into my life. December will be 2 years that we've been married. And 8 months ago tomorrow, I got out of prison. They talked about how they'll bring people in your life, how God, will bring people in your life to teach you a lesson. And there's a friend of mine, as I was on this journey, I had known him since juvenile hall, and he went to board after I went to board, and he got found suitable. And he's getting ready to go home. And he says, hey, can I ask you a question? I'm like, yes, most definitely. He said, if there was somebody getting you in trouble, preventing you from going home and being with your family, would you consider that person a friend, or would you consider him an enemy? And I said, that guy would be my worst enemy. And he tells me, what are you doing to yourself? And I had to look at my life and start looking at the decisions that I was making and the choices that I was making. And they weren't the ones that were positive. They weren't the ones that were going to get me out of prison. So I had to find a way to be courageous. And then I got invited with this group of men to help change the culture of prison. And after hearing that, after being in prison for 20 years, there's a part of me that says there's no changing, but I'll go for the ride. And then I had the opportunity to go back to school. The crop organization paid for it, and ended up getting certified. And I ended up doing the right things to go back. So I ended up going back to prison. Not back to prison. I'm not doing that. So I ended up going back to board the first time before I got found suitable. And I got denied one more time. And there was a guy that I was working with while I was there. And he said, he came to my door that morning because I was a little discouraged. I threw a pity party. Nobody showed up. So I'm sitting there by myself. And when I go out that morning, he comes up to the door and he's like, hey, can I ask you a question? I'm like, yeah, for sure. He's like, I believe that God kept you here so that you can help me. And it made me stop feeling sorry for myself and realize, like, look, you're put here to do something more than just feel sorry for yourself. So I eventually, like I said, went back to board and got found suitable. 28 days after I got out of prison, I got hired as an alcohol and drug counselor. I work in Watts, and I just got promoted to lead counselor. And it's not because, I'm some incredible guy. It's because God has blessed me. It's because I've done the work. Like, I'm willing to step out of my comfort zone, And I think, Farshad, I think, Roger, they believed in me. They gave me an opportunity to do something different. So I want to thank you for your time. One thing I want to say about the book is that the proceeds of the book, one thing that I've learned in recovery is that being of service to other people. So the idea behind this book, the proceeds, there's a school in Monterey next to the prison. It's called Palma High School. And we would do book readings with them. And one thing that we learned is that whoever goes to Palma, they choose the college they go to. So we identified a young man in that area whose family wasn't financially stable, who couldn't afford for him to go to that high school. So what we did was we went cell to cell. We collect donations over $3,000. We put this book together, and all those proceeds are going to be put towards other young men going to a high school for a promised future. So thank you again for your time, for your encouragement, for your prayers, and thank you, Mr. Prashad, for the opportunity.
This is a very emotional moment for me. And let me tell you why. I had no clue when I walked into this prison. And everything started with a very small vision and dream. And I asked God, I said, how can I help these people to do something? I got a letter from prison. He didn't share the letter. I got like 14, 15 different letters. One of them said, Farshad, before you came to prison, we had dope. Now we have hope, but we are dopeless. Another letter I received was, Farshad, we have started different departments in prison. We have editing departments. We are gathering stories. We are translating stories. They got up to almost 42 stories, and we narrow it down to 11 stories in this book. And guess what? Chapter 1 is Johnny's story. And 10 more of fantastic people whose lives been transformed is in this book. And yes, all the proceeds will go to support people to find the right school. How does that sound, guys? Yeah.